In 2005, Dr. Osamu Kato requested the development of a channel dilator based on the structure of torus that has high penetration ability. The features required for this were flexible but not breakable, safe enough to pass through narrow spaces with rotational manipulation, and great deliverability and trackability. In response to this request, the engineers prepared numerous trial products. Physicians have also repeatedly tested these products, and successful development of Corsair was finally achieved. The launch was in January 2010. Around 2004 and 2005, I talked with ASAHI Intect and asked them to make this catheter. Before this, there was the device called Tonus that had a similar structure, and ASAHI Intect had made it. In the case of the Tonus, the entire length of the shaft is made of stainless steel, but a channel dilator would not work well if all the parts were metal. We're going through collateral channels with it, so it is high risk. Ultimately, the surface of the torus had to be coated in polymer, or it couldn't be used. A polymer coating is fine, but there was a serious problem. Torus, of course, is rotatable. The rotation applied at hand, as there is a stainless steel braiding through the entire shaft, is transmitted to the distal tip. However, torque transmits through stainless steel, but the distal tip is of course made of polymer, which means there's a gap between the stainless steel and the polymer. Then tearing at that gap is an issue. That was the first problem we encountered when I asked ASAHI Intect to develop a channel dilator. The initial discussions were not promising. There was talk that it would be extremely difficult for ASAHI Intect to produce what we were asking for, and that the physical limitations might be impossible to overcome. The reality was that it took more than 5 years to bring this to market, and during that time the engineers worked very hard. If there's a risk that the distal tip could come off, it is extremely difficult for a manufacturer to guarantee a product, and at one point the project was abandoned. However, one of the ASAHI Intect engineers we had worked with for a while persisted. He worked very hard and came up with a different structure. His answer was a double-layer braiding, which he thought would solve the problem, and in fact the product was launched in 2007 and named the Corsair. Since 2007, Dr. Osamu Kato began using prototypes of Corsair in an experimental manner and performed the reverse cart technique using an IBIS catheter as a standard method that gives direct vision when crossing the CTO. The registry data for this method have been published. With the launch of Fielder XT and Corsair specialized for channel tracking, the procedure of reverse cart put forward by Dr. Kato was standardized. Device improvements and sharing of CTO treatment techniques through live demonstration courses have positioned the retrograde approach as preeminent in CTO treatment, leading to the standardization of the CTO PCI techniques and the global adoption of reverse cart. As Corsair became more widespread so that reverse cart could be carried out, it became possible to observe the behavior of retrograde CTO wires inside CTO lesions using an IBIS catheter inserted in the antegrade direction. This provided an opportunity for elucidating the mechanism of the CTO wire behavior and later led to the development of Gaia. CART, which is inserting the balloon catheter from a retrograde approach and dilating it from the retrograde, was quickly replaced by the reverse CART. This was completely reversed and replaced by inserting the balloon from an antegrade approach. This procedure allowed us to bring in a number of devices through the antegrade. From retrograde, you cannot bring in IVUS. At best, all you can bring in is a wire. However, with reverse CART, it became possible to insert an IVUS catheter from an antegrade approach for CTO treatment. When the IVUS catheter is placed in CTO lesions, you can see the behavior of the retrograde wire that is coming in from the opposite direction. When you're actually maneuvering the wire, you can now observe and understand with the IVUS how the wire is moving and how the tissue inside the CTO is responding. We finally understood those two things: how Fielder XT is able to pass through the CTO and how the wire behaves. This was the biggest leap in understanding the CTO since the development of the Miracle, the first wire useful for CTO PCI ever. Throughout the Miracle development process, we had a very limited understanding of the maneuvering and mechanism of CTO wires. And one of the byproducts of the retrograde approach I mentioned earlier is that we now understand the wire behavior and mechanism. The launch of Gaia was in July 2012. Understanding about the movement of CTO wires deepened, and Dr. Osamu Kato and Asahi Intech investigated in detail from square one and collaboratively developed the functions needed for CTO wires. After Fielder XT was marketed, there had been reports of crossing being achieved simply at loci where crossing had previously been impossible, even using stiff wires. On this basis, Dr. Osamu Kato's position is that tip flexibility is highly important in relation to CTO wires. However, the CTO wire tip load and the flexibility of the tip work against each other in conventional wires. A number of Asahi Intech technologies were required to resolve this contradiction, and Dr. Osamu Kato and the engineers worked together on 40 or more trial runs to develop the needed product. The flexible tip makes it easy to change direction even within lesions, which makes it possible for the physician to rationally maneuver CTO wires according to the principles of wire movement. Thus, now it is possible to bring the guide wire along the run line as desired. We have developed a much better understanding of how we want CTO wires to function. In the process, we faced the problem of needing both flexibility at the tip of the wire and torque transmission to the tip. Another thing is that at the same time, we were increasing our understanding of what exactly a wire's ability to penetrate tissue depends on. It was during the development of the Gaia wire that we learned a great deal by conducting a series of bench tests over time with the engineers we were working with. In the past, we had thought that only tip load and torque strength mattered. But we came to understand that it was not these features that the wire required, but something else. In the first stages of developing Gaia, having to combine a flexible tip and torque transmission with the ability to penetrate was a serious problem. The issue was that, like all wires in the past, torque transmission was basically 80 to 90% dependent on the wire core. In other words, the thicker the core, the stronger the torque, and the better the transmission. Therefore, we realized that a structure that depends entirely on the wire core for torque would be impossible to achieve. That's when we came up with Act 1. By adopting Act 1, we were able to solve one of these problems. Another important question was how to achieve the ability to penetrate tissue, even with flexible wires. The tapered wire, like Conquest, offered a hint. From the beginning, we had thought about tapering the wire. However, we gradually realized that tapering only the shaft is not very effective. At a load of less than 9 grams, the thickness of the core in the Conquest wire makes torque transmission extremely difficult, and the wire ends up with a double bend. And we found this was a problem that we could not get around. So, we decided to adopt Act 1. In other words, instead of relying on the core used in conventional wires, we could achieve torque transmission using an unconventional method by inserting the Act 1. For another question on how to maintain penetration ability, we found that tapering just the shaft would not be enough. But why not make the wire tip more pointed? We came up with the idea of sharpening the distal tip like a thumbtack to improve penetration. At first, there were pros and cons to this method, but after a great deal of trial and error, as the engineers conducted repeated bench tests, we gradually came to understand what we needed to aim for to make this method feasible. In the process, we arrived at the design used in today's Gaia wire. We succeeded in achieving all 3 important functions of a CTO wire: tip flexibility, the ability to penetrate tissue, and torque transmission. ASAHI Intech launched Gaia Next. The X-strand structure was introduced, and development was initiated with the aims of reducing the risk of wire breakage occurring inside hard lesions and dramatically increasing durability. As a result of the development process, torque force was increased and penetration effectiveness was increased, in connection with which the maneuverability increased dramatically. Dr. Osamu Kato stated that the CTO guide wire has successfully achieved one of its objectives. The initial concept behind the Gaia was to develop a wire that would be the first choice in treating CTO. We came close to everything we set out to achieve. It is true that we created a wire based on a different concept than conventional wires, but unfortunately the torque was not yet as strong as it needed to be. So the question of how to improve the torque was one of the development issues that ASAHI Intech faced. In addition, after the Gaia wire came to market, the somewhat frequent wire breakage was an issue. The wire core breaks, the coil when uncoiled. This was a serious clinical problem. And because it was a problem, ASAHI Intech also wanted to work on fixing this issue. So all of us wanted to focus on the problem. What we came up with is what is now called the X-strand coil structure. Using the X-strand coil instead of a conventional wire coil, we were finally able to resolve a critical problem for the Gaia. This also solved the problem of the coil uncoiling when the wire broke. In my opinion, we finally achieved our original goals for the Gaia with the Gaia Next wire. There are still some issues, but I think the Gaia Next will eventually replace Gaia. I believe that when the use of Gaia Next is more widespread, then we will finally see wires become the first choice for treating CTO.
得られるんじゃないかなというふうに僕は理解してるんですけど。